everyone, and welcome to another video about late 90s, early 2000s BMWs and reliability. Today we're going to be looking at transmissions, and specifically what transmissions were in those BMWs of that era and what could go wrong with them. Now before we begin, I just want to say that I'm not an expert in transmissions, so if you have anything to add, feel free to mention it in the comments. This video is simply just more of a starting point. Anyways, let's begin. So, at the time, BMW used the same transmissions throughout their cars, with a few modifications. Starting with the E46 3 Series, you could get a 4 and 5 speed GM automatic transmission, you could get a 5-speed ZF automatic transmission, and for manuals, you could get a 5-speed ZF manual or a 6-speed getrag manual. And the same goes for the E39 5 Series. As for the E38 7 Series, most of them came with a ZF automatic transmission, but there are a few that came in ZF 5-speed manuals. And as for the X5 at the time, the first generation, all inline 6s came with a 5-speed GM transmission. And as for the V8s, prior to the facelift, they also came with a 5-speed GM transmission that was an automatic, but you could also get, after the facelift, V8s that had 6-speed ZF automatics. And there were a few cases where you could also find 6-speed manuals for the X5. And as for the M cars, the M3 and M5 shared a 6-speed manual getrag transmission, while the M3 got a 6-speed SMG transmission. So, looking at reliability, I'll start with the automatic transmissions first. So, let's take a look at a few common issues, starting with the E46 M3 and specifically the SMG2 gearbox. Now, the SMG2 gearbox is essentially a 6-speed manual getrag transmission, but with an automated clutch, and that's why they call it an electro-hydraulic manual transmission. Now, unfortunately, this transmission, out of all the BMWs in this era, has the scariest reputation, and that's because of repair costs. So the most common problem by far is the relay. If you have any electrical problem, replace it. It's an easy $20 fix, and it takes about 5 minutes to replace. If the car doesn't want to change gears, even though you're telling it to, it could be a gear position sensor. If the car is violently changing gears, then it could be a few things. It could be not enough transmission fluid, it could be a leaking clutch slave cylinder, or worse, it could be the clutch itself. But it's worth noting that the SMG2 gearbox is meant for track use, and that means that shifts and the transmission itself are generally going to be harder than other transmissions. But the scariest problem by far is the hydraulic pump, and signs can range anywhere from warning lights on the dash to the transmission simply giving out. Now, I've heard stories where the SMG2 gearbox has costed over $15,000 in repairs, but don't let that scare you from looking at or purchasing an SMG2 M3. Just make sure you know someone who can properly diagnose and replace these transmissions. You hear many stories where shops replace components of the transmissions that simply don't need to be replaced, especially the clutch itself. That's a very common part that gets replaced even though it doesn't need to be. All in all, just make sure the electrical components such as sensors and solenoids are looked at before dwelling into the big mechanical components. Moving on to the other automatic transmissions, the ZF and GM transmissions of that era actually encounter pretty similar problems, and sometimes it's indicated by a yellow cog that appears on the dash. If you do have a problem with the transmission, the first thing you should always do is look at whether or not you're low on transmission fluid. Now, let's say you're changing the fluid. With both the ZF and GM transmissions, you're going to need roughly 6 quarts or 5.5 liters. If you're changing the fluid on a GM transmission, I believe you can use a generic automatic transmission fluid. As for these ZFs, you actually have to use their own specific fluid, or at least it's recommended that you do it. And unfortunately, 6 quarts of their fluid costs roughly $200. Depending on the car, the interval of the fluid is usually about 50,000 miles to change it, or 80,000 kilometers. But some manufacturers say that the fluid will actually last the whole entire lifetime of the car. Regardless of what transmission you choose though, the most generic problems are losing reverse, losing park, losing certain gears, hard shifts, and weird noises. So let's start off with losing reverse. Now with the GM transmissions, it could be really simple as just replacing the reverse solenoid in the valve body, and what that does is it basically moves hydraulic fluid to engage and disengage the reverse gear. As for the ZF transmissions, it could be an electrical issue in the valve body, but most likely you are going to have to replace the reverse drum. What about losing certain gears while driving? For instance, the car shifts from second to third, and then it suddenly feels like it's in neutral. Now this could be due to a few issues, but the most common issue is the clutch pack, which is associated with the drive gear that's failed. I know with the GM transmissions, third gear seems to fail at higher mileage, and that's because the 3/4 clutch pack, so the clutch pack that's associated with third gear, fails unfortunately at higher mileage. It gets worn out. Now what if the transmission is shifting harder than usual, especially downshifts? Now this could be due to a number of reasons, such as modules that need firmware updates. It could also be due to low transmission fluid, or even clutch actuators. However, one common problem in both the ZF and GM transmissions that causes these harder shifts is the transmission temperature. Overheating can cause oil not to be distributed properly, and that can lead to rough shifts. Now, overheating can be due to loss of coolant, or it can be due to debris clogging certain parts in the cooling system. Now, rough shifts can also be due to adapters not properly regulating oil in the valve body, or it could also be worn out valves in the valve body itself. It could also be the torque converter, but the usual sign of a failing torque converter is weird grinding noises, vibrations at high speeds, or the car just simply stalling if you have an automatic transmission car. And that's one of the jobs of the torque converter, which makes sure that your automatic transmission car doesn't stall. And unfortunately, with the failed torque converter, there isn't a sign on the dash that appears. Now, as I said before, it's hard to diagnose these issues, and it's pretty common when, let's say, you have a simple issue such as a solenoid or a valve that needs to be replaced, and unfortunately the shop thinking the only way to fix this is to replace the whole entire valve body. Now, before we move on to manual transmissions, I guess one common question is, are GM transmissions or ZF transmissions more reliable? And which one is more reliable really depends. But generally, ZF transmissions and GM transmissions have the same failing components, and I find that these components tend to fail at higher mileage on ZF transmissions than they do on GM transmissions, and unfortunately when they do fail on ZF transmissions, it usually costs a bit more money to replace them. Now for manual transmissions, it honestly depends on the driver and whether or not the transmission was properly maintained or not. But I can honestly say that manual transmissions are much more reliable than automatic transmissions, and that's because manual transmissions are simply much more simpler. They have much less moving components and therefore less chance of something failing. Now for manual transmissions, apart from minor issues, there's not too many things that can go wrong. The most common issue is the clutch itself, and the usual sign of that is the transmission slipping. Apart from that, maybe gear linkages or synchro mesh, typically around second or third gear, and that's because those gears get used the most. But other than that, manual transmissions will simply last longer than automatic transmissions. Well, there you have it. Now, keep in mind, I'm no transmission expert, and if you are experiencing problems with your transmission, unless you're 100% confident you can work on it yourself, I suggest taking it to an expert or someone who really knows how to work on these, as even dealerships themselves tend to have problems working on them. I hope you guys found this informative, or at least a good starting point. Now, I do plan on making more videos about reliability with older BMWs in the next few coming weeks, especially looking at V8s, older V8s. Either way, make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.